hit record. And great. Can you guys see my the presentation? Great. Well, welcome everyone to day 2 of the virtual charrette for the Datura and Evernia Streetscape project. My name is Brad Davis with Alta Planning and Design, and we are leading the design team for this project along with Ecosistema Urbana. And today we are going to be sharing some of the refinement of concepts that we developed yesterday, the 3 scenarios that we're developing, and we're putting more detail to that, and we want to share some of that work in progress presentation with you all. After the open house today, we'll also be posting a survey to get some input on these 3 scenarios and give you a little more time to digest the different concepts and provide feedback to us as we continue to incorporate your input from the community. So the agenda for today, we're going to be giving an overview of the design alternatives, and then giving a presentation with some more detail about each of the scenarios. So an overview of these scenarios. I'm just going to describe each of these. So scenario 1 is a 2-way street with updates to the existing streetscape. So what that really means is that scenario 1 will retain the existing vehicular circulation as a 2-lane roadway while maintaining all of the drainage and curbs. It'll look pretty similar to today. Parking areas will remain, the streetscape and pedestrian areas will be upgraded to provide more comfort and a sense of place. So you can think, some additional landscaping, some additional trees, something like that. Accessibility and comfort for pedestrians will be provided with shade and vegetated buffers. Landscape, site furniture, lighting, and other engaging elements will provide a sense of pedestrian scale. So just kind of sprucing up what's already there, maybe some change in material or something like that. We also developed these diagrams to begin to describe what's going to change and whether there'll be more space allocated or less space allocated to these different types of features of the street. So in this scenario, the only thing that's going to change is adding some minor space additions for landscaping. Like I said, maybe changing some of the trees from palm trees to some type of shade tree, and maybe reprogramming some of the on-street parking space, say for loading or some type of access to the adjacent buildings along the street. Scenario 2 is a 2-way shared street concept. So what that means is that it will retain the existing vehicular circulation as a 2-lane roadway. However, the configuration of the curbs will change and the street will transform into a shared street. So you can think Clematis Street streetscape that was recently done, or the new streetscape along Rosemary Avenue. Vehicle speed and volume in this part of town make shared streets a feasible option by removing the formal distinctions between spaces dedicated to pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorized vehicles. The street is shared by everyone, with each user becoming increasingly aware and respectful of the others. In some blocks of scenario 2, the street will become an extension of the buildings, providing seating areas, outdoor dining, public art opportunities. On-street parking will be accommodated at some, but not all blocks, and hardscape, landscape, lighting will provide clues to people using the space, whether a pedestrian or a motorist. So in terms of the space changes, what we will be reallocating space from on-street parking and narrowing some of the vehicular travel lanes. And what that will allow us to do is create more space for wider sidewalks, more landscaping and shade, and more flexible programming of space for loading zones or for different types of activities or events. And scenario 3 is the most drastic in terms of reallocation of space. It's converting Datura and Evernia Street into one-way pairs. Scenario 3 will convert from one-way to two-way. As I mentioned, it will also become a shared street. By removing a travel lane on Datura and Evernia, this allows maximum pedestrian space, including the integration of meaningful green space. There are opportunities to create a linear park along the street and more of a destination adjacent to the businesses and residential areas. A single lane conversion will provide space for shade trees, seating, and more extensive landscape areas. The additional space also allows for the most flexibility in maintaining on-street parking. There are other one-way streets downtown that would integrate nicely with this scenario, such as Dixie, Olive, and Narcissus. And as I mentioned, the trade-offs in terms of space is drastically changing and reducing the amount of on-street parking, removing one vehicular travel lane. And what that does is it frees up space for more sidewalks, shade, and landscaping, and a lot more flexible space. It also impacts vehicular access to destinations, so that might be a trade-off that we'll need to consider. So when you put all of these three stacked together, you'll see that there's not a one-size-fits-all strategy for how we can change and improve Datura Street and Evernia Street. So what we're going to be talking about over the next hour is what some of those different trade-offs, design considerations, what you get, what you have to trade in order to get that within the finite amount of street space that we have to work with along these two streets. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Donnie to talk about the study blocks that we are going to share this afternoon.
Sure. Just to help us further refine and test these ideas, it really helps us to look more at a single block scale as opposed to a whole street. So the two blocks we're going to be looking at today are both on Datura. We'll be looking at Datura from Dixie to Olive, and in this existing cross section, you can kind of see some of the characteristics of the street: two lanes and one lane in each direction, parking on both sides. The lanes tend to be a little wider on this street than they are on some others. Adequate sidewalks, but not very large, somewhat constrained. And then you get a mix of existing buildings, but also existing surface parking lots on this street. Next slide. Actually, Brad, can you move forward 2 slides? My apologies, they're out of order. So this is a look at that street. You see the surface parking lot on the left, spattering of trees, some buildings on the right, but generally a pretty wide existing streetscape. You can see an existing striped center median on that street. If you could go back to that one, thank you. And then for Olive to Narcissus, very similar cross section to the previous block. The trees here are palm trees, so that creates a bit of a different setting. And in general, the buildings tend to be a lot taller and they tend to be continuous along this block, which creates a very narrow kind of sensation when you're on the street. Makes it feel a little tighter than some of the other blocks. If you could go back 1 slide, Brad. So here's a look at that one. Existing parking garage on the left, which may present an opportunity to do something with the facade. But otherwise, a mix of residential and commercial, and a pretty consistent rhythm to the buildings. Can move forward to the next section, and I believe we're going to be throwing it to Chloe.
Yes. Great. Yes, so this scenario is the two-way street with minimal movement of curbs. And what we've really been thinking about here is how we can activate the space as much as possible with doing very little to the streetscape itself. From Dixie to Olive, we have a little bit more of an opportunity to play around with how that space is allocated. Those wide lanes and a bit of a striped median in between them allow for some flexibility. Generally, the alignment of the road should probably stay the same in this scenario. In this image, it's playing on it a little bit of a wider sidewalk on the south side of the street, but still using that in curb-to-curb space for parklet spaces. And I'll be showing some images of parklets in a minute, but essentially using that space still within the curb-to-curb roadway to activate it and to enact changes that can be temporary, but they can also be very finished and very wonderful and activated and be at the same level of the sidewalk due to the change. So a lot of this two-way with curb-to-curb scenario has to do with playing with the potential of using parking spaces for parklets. That's not to say that every single block shouldn't have parking on it. Most of the blocks that we've been working with feel that there should be some parking maintained on street. But this is just showing you a little bit of what it would look like if all of the parking was used in this scenario. For the north side of the street, this is playing around with the idea of keeping it really wide, making it a comfortable space for pedestrians, and honestly, all other mobility that wants to be had on Datura. So thinking about that, thinking about elements like street lighting and bigger canopy trees than are there now. Next slide, please. For Olive to Narcissus, we, like Donnie said, are dealing with a little bit more of a narrow right-of-way here. The lanes are already pretty much as narrow as they can go, but we have that flexibility again with the parking. So in order to really activate the street, utilizing the parking in this block is pretty crucial to expanding those sidewalks, expanding the feel of the general passages of the street, and not making it feel so car-centric. Cars on the other side of the sidewalk will also, block a lot of activity that you can see around there. So should there be furniture alongside the sidewalk, you can really activate that space and make it feel more like it's for the people that are engaging in the area. Like Donnie said as well, the scale is very different here as well. The buildings are tall, so the palms kind of enhance that, and perhaps we want to see some interventions that'll keep it more pedestrian scale. So here you can see canopies introduced for shade, but also aesthetics and for feel of the space. There is supposed to be a green wall on this section, so you can see a little bit of that there. It's already in the makings to be very cool. But again, just that all the activation elements, there's a lot that you can do with a little amount of space. So we can see that in the next slide. Again, whether it's temporary or semi-permanent or permanent, there are a lot of changes that can be made with the space, even if it's not entirely changed with curbs and widened and completely open to pedestrians only. There's a lot that you can do here. You can mess around with the pavements, the texture of the pavements, the painting that you can have here, the striping. You can do it in the roadway or on the sidewalks just themselves. There's a lot of different options for going about that. Next slide. And here you're seeing more of the elements that can be introduced that are not just pavement, that can be overhead, furniture that can be introduced, you know, rather than making entirely new planting spaces, you can introduce planters like these funky ones that you see here. You can really add a lot of character, even though you're still dealing with pretty small spaces. And they can be interactive as well, such as these seesaws. All right, well, I think that brings us to scenario 2.
And moving on, we're looking at a two-way street that looks at more of a full curb or full right-of-way redesign. So moving curbs, and in the case of these streets, looking at potentially eliminating curbs. So a theme that you'll see between on both blocks is bringing in something similar to what is on Clematis and what's on Rosemary, which is more of a curbless street. So these feature very kind of a flat profile across, and they help divide pedestrian space away from vehicular or shared biking space by changes in surfaces or things like lighting elements or street trees that further help define the space. And in general, we can view these kinds of shared streets a bit, they're very flexible. There's no one model for a shared street. So this first one, looking at Dixie to Olive, looking at that shared street across, doesn't need to be crazy fun pavement, but it could be. It could also be simple pavers. It could be concrete. There's a lot of options there. But this option, this particular cross section looks at the potential for keeping parking on both sides in some locations. And this wouldn't necessarily need to be everywhere, but in select locations, there may be the need for parking on both sides. We still can tighten up the lanes so the lanes are tighter. We can add additional street trees, and we can widen the sidewalks in a lot of locations. So this is kind of like a very minimum intervention. We can also add things like overhead lighting or shade structures to further help create the idea of the street as really kind of this place, a really landmark place. Can you go to the next slide? So this is the same street, but with that kind of kit of parts mindset. In certain locations, maybe there's no demand for parking on either side of the street. And so in those locations, we can bring in things like an additional row of trees that might be really beneficial on the north side of the street where there's a lot of sun exposure, and that might help really cool it down. It also helps create additional space that can be used for restaurant seating where there's existing commercial or potentially where there's vacant commercial spaces, which would be very attractive to future businesses. There's also other flexible options, things like parklets that could be introduced, or just additional landscape to further help green up and cool the space down a bit. Next slide. So this is looking at Olive to Narcissus. And so Olive to Narcissus, kind of as I mentioned before, different from the other block. This one has the really tall buildings, which present a more of a challenge for creating a comfortable experience because you feel very small and constrained in between them and the cars. And so what we wanted to do here, similar to the last block, but even more so, really create this overhead plane. Again, this could be a formalized shade structure that's strung between these tall buildings. They could be overhead lighting, and I'll show some examples of that in a few slides. There's also the option for flexible amenities like food truck space, or it could be reconfigured just to have a double wide sidewalk, which may be needed in areas where we're expecting more pedestrian demand. Next slide, please. So kind of at the heart of this concept is this idea of shared streets, where there is space for cars, and in some instances it's entirely dedicated to cars. But the idea that it's not rigid and there isn't a ton of space dedicated to cars. So you see in these examples, in the top left one's Clematis, the paving really stretches across. It creates this flat surface. Everybody knows where they should or shouldn't be based on what mode of transportation they're in. But there's subtle cues, things like trees, vegetation, slight changes in paving that really kind of cue you in. It can be something very kind of historic looking, like the image on the right could have pavers with embedded street trees in it to help define the spaces. Or you can get really funky and crazy with it. Something like a painted street or a colorful paved street like the bottom left is another example of a shared street, just with a different surface application. Next slide. And so, again, talking about that idea of kind of this kit of parts when it comes to a shared street, could be parking on both sides, but in most locations it really may not need to be. And so we can think about the different ways and different uses that we use that little space alongside the street to complement existing building uses. So in locations where there are restaurants, top left image, you can see the street really becomes seating space for that restaurant. It really activates and adds a lot of life on the street. It makes it feel like a safer place, but also lets people know that this is a place to hang out. In locations where you can get large enough trees, it could be a respite away from the shade, things like hammocks. If you're able to get large enough trees in there, it could be a really innovative and fun and funky element to attract people. It could be more classic parklets, but maybe with a bit more of a permanent feel. The one in the middle shows kind of more of like a workspace parklet. So if you have businesses or offices, there's a lot of those on those two blocks. This may be a creative way to show that this space isn't just for eating, it's not just for relaxing or playing, it might be for people who actually work in this area as well. And then the images on the right, the top one is looking at really kind of bringing in a lot of green, softening up the street as much as possible. And the bottom one is more that idea of play. Again, I like to think about the person on their lunch break, maybe exhausted from a long day and just wants to hit a ping pong ball. So a shared street concept creates space for all sorts of different activities along it. Next slide. And the last element to talk about, because I showed them in the sections, and I think it's pretty key, not just to these blocks, but to all the blocks, given that especially the north side of the street gets a whole lot of heat during the day, and there's a lot of white buildings that reflect the light. Trying to find some creative and innovative ways to get shade in there. So obviously shade trees is the most obvious answer to that, but wanted to explore some more, some different, possibly more creative shade options. So that could be something very sculptural and really eye-grabbing, especially at night, like the image on the left. It could be a continuous overhead plane, like the images in the middle. And these could be used to create different densities of shade. So it doesn't have to be all dark and in the shade. You could get kind of a dappled shade to create the sensation of being under a tree. And then additionally, there's the idea of light. And so there's different ways to create light. It could be classic kind of hung bulbs across the street or different kinds of LEDs. There's also other creative products like solar lights that could be strung to create just really dynamic shows at night, which would further enhance the character of the street. And I think now we're gonna pass it to Emily, who'll talk about one-way streets.
Thanks, Donnie. So as Donnie said, this scenario is exploring what the street could look like if we took out a lane and just had one-way movement on the street. Specifically, Datura would be an eastbound street, so it would head towards the waterfront, and then Evernia, the pair, would head westbound towards the commuter rail station, just to orient you. This section in particular, from Dixie to Olive, has a lot of vacant land on the north side, or not necessarily vacant land, but underutilized, and a lot of offices and businesses on the south side that have more modern facades, whereas the north side has more historical facades. So we kind of wanted to play on what we could do with all of the extra space when we just have one drive lane. And part of that is looking at a linear park that kind of just draws you down the corridor towards the water, and creating kind of a microclimate on one side of the street with all of the subtropical plants, shade trees, and little pockets where a person on their lunch break could eat with a friend, just take a phone call, just kind of little pockets as the pathway undulates down the road. And we also wanted to expand the pedestrian space on the south side and pull parking in to the road a little bit more, so there's more room to pass by when you're walking on the sidewalk. Next slide. This next block, Olive to Narcissus, is a little bit of a different take on the same concept. We wanted to look at a curbless option, similar to what Donnie, his group, looked at. And we wanted to look at what if the drive lane kind of curved as it went down the block. It wasn't just a straight road, but it gives the opportunity to kind of focus the extra space on places where the land use could really make the most of it. And it gives great opportunities for plazas in the middle or on the side of the road, but and it really helps fill in the tree canopy because you just have 14 feet of drive lane, and the rest of the space can be filled in with trees, activation, and I just showed a couple of different ways you could use that space. So you could have some interesting street furnishings with a shade structure overhead. You could have outdoor dining in front of restaurants. So especially in front of existing restaurants, we wanted to maybe curve the drive lane to the other side of the road so that restaurants could use it for outdoor dining and have more space for tables and for activation and life. There's also the opportunity to have public art or play space in the extra space. As you can see in that, on that right bottom concept, we're just showing a public art sculpture with where you can, interact with it, and different vegetation options that could exist. Another reason for keeping some of the activation focused on the south side of this block is because the buildings create more shade here, and there's just the land uses are a little bit more conducive to activation in the near term. Next slide. And here are just a couple of precedent images for one-way, some are two-way, but shared streets. And as you can see, bollards play a huge role, as well as landscaping, to kind of delineate where the car is allowed versus where is just purely pedestrian space. I think what's really great about these streets is that the parking areas kind of seamlessly fit into the street, and there's ways that you can mark those spaces off. You don't need pavement markings necessarily, but a great difference in pavers, in color if you use paint, like a mural paint or something like that, can really make the statement and delineate different space. And then I think there's just a lot more room for pockets of landscaping in a lot of different ways, with raised planters, with flush landscaped areas, and street furniture wrapped around. Next slide, please. This one, these kind of look at look at two of the blocks. The two images on the left kind of work for the Dixie and Olive Street concept with focusing the pedestrian space purely on one side as opposed to alternating back and forth like the last picture. When you focus it on the one side, it kind of gives this linear park, this continuous green space that pulls you down the corridor, which is really wonderful. And I think it creates a lot of opportunities for redevelopment and adjacent land uses. And it helps connect some of the green spaces that already exist. So there's the amphitheater down at the end of the corridor, and then there's the Zen garden at the corner of Dixie. So you kind of have this emerald necklace sort of created when you have this big green passageway connecting all of the parks that already exist. The last image is just kind of shows how when the road curves in the block, it kind of creates these pockets where you can designate for activation and bigger pockets of green space. And there's just a lot you can do with the extra space and a lot of freedom when you have the one-way configuration. Next slide.
Well, thank you, Donnie, Emily, and Chloe for presenting each of those concepts. Our design team is going to continue to develop these concepts further for all of the blocks along Datura and Evernia so that we can come back with a kind of fully vetted or developed concept for each of these scenarios to give more detail to each block and what it might look like. And so there will be more opportunities tomorrow to watch our design team work. They include 2 more virtual open studios. They, again, will be in the morning from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. and in the afternoon from 2 to 3 p.m. Again, these are opportunities to see kind of work in process and hear what we're working on. And then tomorrow evening, we'll be back again during the same time slot from 5 to 6 p.m. to share our work in progress again with more detailed concepts, as I mentioned, and also starting to look at some of the other public space opportunities along the corridors, such as what we might do with Post Park, how we might program some of the space, particularly east of Narcissus. We've been hearing a lot of discussion about how we try to preserve the flexibility of those streets and public spaces or park spaces for events while also trying to provide enhancements for daily life as well. There's a kind of balance and trade-off with all of those. So we'll be testing those in more detail as well. I also want to remind everyone that you can still take the online survey if you haven't. You can find it on the project website, reimaginingDatura-and-Evernia.com, or you can go to this link shared here. So far, we've got 113 surveys. Hopefully, we've gotten some more over the past day. And it's been really helpful to see that feedback where we are asking not only where people want to invest their money along each street, but also what they want to invest in. It's really helpful for us as a design team to get that feedback and start to refine these 3 scenarios. if you have specific information that you want to share with us, you have an idea that comes into your mind, you can share it with the design team by submitting it through the contact page of the project website. Or you can continue to sign up for updates if you haven't done so yet. And lastly, we'll continue to share information on the project Facebook page and streaming our meetings that I just listed on the project page as well using Facebook Live. So we look forward to continuing to share our work in progress and hearing from you all. So thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you.